Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they will appear here in my chat room. And the chat room is on the screen today, as I have no guest, and we can all share it together. And I hope that you're having a lovely day. Today is Tuesday, and my stated subject for today is when we don't get the things we want. And this is a continuation of yesterday's conversation about what we really want from life and the ideas of what life is about, how we come to understand what we really want and what will really make us happy in life, and how we then move on to get it. Today, I wanted to talk about how sometimes when we don't get what we want or what we think we want, it actually can work out to our benefit, and how what we think we want and what we actually want and need are not always the same thing, and why this is important in metaphysics. In metaphysics, we use magic to try to bring about the things that we want in life, or at least that we consciously want. And sometimes this is remarkably effective, and sometimes it's not. And one of the big questions that people in metaphysics have is, why is it sometimes not effective? And there are a couple of different answers to that. For some people, the answer is, well, you didn't do it right. And sometimes that might be true. For other people, the answer is, well, you had crossed wires. You thought you wanted it, but you were really keeping it away from yourself. That's one of the things I will say sometimes. Um, there are a number of reasons, but sometimes it's just not what was meant um, for this particular timeline in your incarnation. And sometimes that can be ultimately for the better. One of the things that I've talked about all of my life, I and a number of people I've worked with, in fact, most of the people I've worked with, had visions of what we might call a time of troubles that I would say we are now in. I spent a lot of my life trying to avoid that, trying to change the timeline so that that unpleasantness did not need to occur. Yet here I am in that more difficult timeline. Why? Well, obviously, it's something that needs to happen. I've talked about it as being global shadow work. I think that in the end is the case, that certain negative things have to happen in order for healing to come after them, hopefully. And hello to Kayleen in the chat room, who says, good morning from Australia. It's good to see you, Kayleen. It's something that, well, I can't say I would have rather avoided it, because I had certainly several chances to die before this came to pass, and obviously did not. So I've chosen to be here and to deal with these challenges. But I feel that they obviously must be spiritually necessary for the future to unfold. I look back on my life. I was talking yesterday about how, just as I completed my education as a commercial artist, that field of employment basically ceased to exist. Now, of course, it didn't all cease to exist in one moment, but to all intents and purposes, it was replaced by graphic arts. Not at all the same thing, very different skills. And the years I had spent learning commercial art no longer had a lot of relevance to future employment. And how that, at first glance, was a very bad thing. But looking back on it from now, though I did not make that my professional field, it turned out to be very useful for what I did do in life. And hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. My work with, most recently, Corellian publications. My knowledge as a commercial artist has been very valuable in pursuing that. And I've often remarked that a commercial artist was trained in certain things a graphic artist apparently is not. One of the things I learned very early on, had to do with grabbing people's attention and holding on to it. Another thing I've noticed is that some of the principles that I was taught under commercial art are drastically different from the attitudes of the next generation down. For example, I was taught that uh, a sans serif font is far better for advertising purposes and most purposes, because it's easier to read. A serif font will tend to stop the eye. So if you want to slow your reader down, you use a serif font. I found younger people who were taught exactly the opposite, which I find very interesting, but I know in my personal experience, I find sans serif fonts much easier to read. Um, and I found that useful in my publishing career. Now, Kayleen says, I made similar attempts to change the timeline and suspect that, in addition to whatever I need to learn personally, I'm here to learn. I'm here to share what I know in these times. I think that's true too. Um, I think that our purposes in life are not only what we need to learn, but also what we have to offer. And I don't feel that my period of having something to offer has ended. And I certainly hope that I have constructive things to add to this rather troubled timeline. And I hope that's true for you too. That I hope that we all can carry part of the weight of making things better together. And one of the things that I have noticed in the oracles that have come out in recent lustrations and other occasions, is that it repeats the fact that the time is now to do the work. The things that we were trained for, in the Corellian tradition at least, which are helping the turn of the age, the time is now to use that skill. The time is now to ease that transition and to work on building that future. This is the time we were prepared for. And we must shoulder that burden. And, is it a burden or a privilege? Well, it certainly could be either. Because usually, most privileges are burdens, and most burdens can be privileges if you can find the way to make them so. And, I've had many great privileges in life in terms of work I've been called to do, which have also had their share of being burdens. But hopefully joyful burdens. Um, I'd have to say that being a spiritual worker has been a great privilege and sometimes very difficult. But I don't see that as bad. I don't look back on it with regret. I look back on it actually with some satisfaction that I was able to rise to those difficulties that did occur. And when I think about those difficult moments, the times when um, I was called upon to help people in terrible situations, the times when I had to deal with really heavy duty healing, the times when I was dealing with heavy duty healing and shadow work for myself, um, I actually look back on these as good things. And I'm glad that I was there and able to do it. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other things I look back on and say, well, I could have done without that. But I ultimately believe that no, I could not. And I look back on the difficulties that have happened, and even in those cases where I don't yet understand why, I'm sure there was a reason. And I think usually those reasons become clear to me, at least. And I look back on the difficulties that I have encountered in life, and I can usually now say, well, yeah, I see why that needed to happen. And I think that all of us, if we're open to it, will be able to do that. I think that all those things that happen for various reasons. Um, and, I am a believer in the idea that everything that happens is for our growth and will make us stronger if we allow it to. Um, I think that we do have a role in that, and we have to allow it to make us better. Um, but I think that everything can do that. And I when I set my subject for today, the subject when we don't get what we want, this was what I wanted to say about it. That sometimes when what we get is not what we thought we wanted, we later will realize it was for the best. It gave us skills we would not otherwise have had. Um, one of the things that I look back upon, my father, I love my father, but he was a very difficult man. He was paranoid schizophrenic. Um, and depending on where he was in his various cycles, he could be incredibly charming and extremely difficult. Um, but I also realized at this point in my life, he was the ideal father for me. Um, and because I had to deal with that very, very early in life, I found a lot of other things much easier to deal with than other people might have found them. Many of the things I've had to deal with politically in the role that I have tread in life were probably easier for me to deal with because I had first dealt with that. It was a training for me. And, as a child, I certainly didn't understand that. And if you had asked me as a child or a teenager, I would have had a very different assessment of the situation. But as an adult, um, I think it was very much for my benefit, and I learned a great deal in terms of how to deal with difficult people, of whom I've dealt with a great many over the course of my life. I'm sure we all do. And, what constitutes a difficult person? Well, I don't know if there is an answer to that because it's really not the person. It's the nature of the interaction between multiple people. And because I dealt with that situation so early in life, many others that might have been far more frustrating if I'd not dealt with that, I was able to deal with far more easily. And this is what I mean when I say that those things that might not seem to have been good when they happened can turn out to be very good for us later. Um, yeah, it is often very difficult for us when we go through difficult times in life to remember that they can ultimately work to our benefit. But I think very often we'll find that they do. In fact, I think if we're open to it, we'll always find that they do. And I think this is important to understanding the nature of life. And, I've remarked before, and let us take a moment for caffeine. But I've remarked before that there are those who have described me as being a Pollyanna. Ed the Pagan frequently describes me as a Pollyanna. The Lady Bitterwind frequently described me as a Pollyanna. Um, but I do have this attitude toward life, and I think it makes life much easier. Um, I think it makes life more understandable, and I certainly find it works for me. And I think always looking for the good in people and in situations has benefited my life. And in the chat room, Mary Hawk says, "Hail, Lady Caffeina." Well, yes, indeed. And Caffeina is one of my favorite goddesses. Caffeina, the goddess of coffee and tea and chocolate. And in the chat room, hello to Ed the Pagan, who says, "Well, I mean it only with love." And I know that is true. Um, of all the people in my life, Ed the Pagan has probably been the most important one. Um, And the next most important has been Crystal High Corral, my teacher and cousin. And after that, my parents. Um, all people who have been huge influences on me in all their different ways. And um, I find that every person in my life has brought something to it. Now, I am a great believer also in that saying that everyone gives your life a blessing. Some give the blessing when they enter your life, and some give the blessing when they leave it. But everyone brings a blessing. But most people who've been in my life for any length of time have definitely been a blessing in my life, and they've all brought something different. And with Ed the Pagan, he is constantly about self-improvement, about understanding why things work, about understanding and fixing problems. Um, Very focused on what we might call, well, I'm going to say the witchness of the why, but in very practical ways. And in that, he's very like Lady Bitterwind was. But she was more concerned with the philosophy of it. And he's much more concerned with um, the everyday improvements. Um, Now, Mary says, you have definitely given me food for thought about some very difficult relationships I have had. I'm glad. I look back at some of my difficult relationships, um, and I'm not sorry that I had them. I mean, I can say that I might have been happier in the moment if I dealt with them with the knowledge I have today, but that was not a possibility. I didn't have that knowledge. I gained it through those relationships. But in my 20s, I had a number of very difficult relationships politically. Um, there are always difficult relationships because that's the nature of being in a position of leadership. There are always going to be times when you're dealing with people who have very different goals. And hello to Magical Mermaid in the chat room. And those situations can become difficult. And every one of them is going to teach you something. And I was talking earlier about how dealing with my father made it much easier for me to deal with people. Well, for example, people whose choices don't seem to make sense in their situation. This is something that I've had occasion to deal with on occasion. Um, Not everyone's decisions seem to make any kind of rational sense, maybe even to themselves. But when that happens, you have to have ways of dealing with it. And one of them is you can't expect to find a rational answer for why they did whatever destructive thing they've done. I'm working with someone at present who's dealing with a situation where someone has done some very destructive things, whose reasoning makes no sense. But I'm assuming that that person is in a place where they're not acting rationally. And because I've known other people in that position, because I've had to deal with this before, I'm able to bring that knowledge to this situation. Um, I look at some political situations I've had to deal with in recent years where people made what I consider absolutely ridiculous decisions that totally damaged themselves. Um, but I know that happens. I know that sometimes there's just nothing you can do, many times. And I've not talked a lot about leadership issues for a while now, but one of the leadership issues that I have learned, and if you're in a position of leadership, you should pay attention to this too. Sometimes people simply self-destruct. They've gotten themselves to where they thought they wanted to be, and they're either frightened by it or overwhelmed by it, and they destroy it because they didn't really want it at all. And when they get into that self-destruct, you know it because no matter how many times you help them to fix the situation, they keep messing it up. When that happens, there's just nothing you can do to fix it. Only they can fix it. And they either will or they won't. And hello to Noah. Noah wrote in the chat room, who gives us greetings from Western Pennsylvania. It's good to see you, Noah. Magical Mermaid says, perhaps we are all here to challenge each other's equilibriums. And, I think that's absolutely true. Here to challenge each other's equilibriums and here to help each other's equilibriums. And hello to Magical Mermaid, if I haven't already said hello. When a person, and I've mostly encountered it in political situations, but you also encounter it in daily life. When a person is intent on self-destruction, you can try to help them, but you can't fix it for them. Only they can fix it. They either will or will not accept your help. I can think of situations where I tried everything I could think of to stop a person from their self-destruction, only to see them continuing to do destructive things, until I finally had to say, well, all right, there's nothing further I can do. And when I first learned this, it was very hard to accept. Because, I was one of those people who thought you could fix everybody. But when I had to accept that, no, sometimes you can't, it was hard, but very important, because I've seen that again and again in the years since. And, you may love that person. You may pity that person. You may have empathy for that person. You may really, really want to help that person. But in the end, if they won't be helped, there's nothing you can do. And sometimes you simply have to step back and leave them to what they need to experience. Sometimes that means they have to hit rock bottom, and then they'll rise like a phoenix from their ashes. And that's wonderful when that happens. And I can think of a few people who I've seen do that. Other times, they hit rock bottom, and that's the end. And that's all they could do in this incarnation. And that's unfortunate, but it's also all right. Because, as my mother wrote in The 5 Mystic Secrets, we all eventually perfect ourselves. We all return to union with Spirit in the fullness of time. We have all the time in existence to do that. We don't do it in this incarnation, that's all right. We get as far as we can. And, if we don't get as far as we wanted, that's all right. We'll have another chance. But having said that, the farther we can get, the better. But when you're dealing with other people, sometimes you have to accept that, they can only get so far. I look at my father. My father could only fix so many things, partly because the way that his issues manifested was partly chemical. There were certain things he just could not physically overcome, could not magically overcome, because my father was a magic user. He felt that had partly caused his problem. Maybe it did. I don't know. Because I often talk about the issue of losing your place in reality when you deal with high-level magic. My father said that's what happened to him. And that certainly did describe how his illness manifested in his life. He would lose his place in reality. And he would be in some other reality. But, he could only get so far in fixing that. That's all right. It's what he could do. And he'll have another incarnation to go farther. Now, I'll also tell you that dealing with him as a spirit after his crossing, those things are not there when dealing with his spirit. When dealing with him as an ancestor, I deal with him as his higher self. that does not have those barriers and those difficulties. One of the things I tell people about dealing with ancestors, I used to know a person who said, well, drunk Uncle Fred is still going to be drunk Uncle Fred as an ancestor. That is not my experience at all. My experience is that when you're dealing with an actual ancestor who is fully crossed over, you're dealing with the higher self of the individual, not the limited physical self. And it can be a very different experience sometimes, depending on how they express themselves in life. You're dealing with their soul level, the part that continues in the soul. And it will not have those same limitations. Now, not everyone who practices ancestor veneration does it in the same way. Different traditions have different experiences, but in my experience, this is what I find. And the way that I practice ancestor veneration, this is what I find. And Magical Mermaid says, lovely to remember. Well, yes, it is. And one of the things that means, if you were estranged from, say, a parent because of your spiritual or other decisions in life, when they have crossed over, assuming they have fully crossed and become an ancestor, you can renew your relationship with them and not have that difficulty, because they will not carry that into the land of the ancestors. And if you try to interact with a spirit and find that they're still dealing with those difficulties, then they have not yet fully crossed over, and there are things you can do about that. And if you study the degree teachings that we have, about which we have some exciting news coming tomorrow, but if you study our degree teachings, we tell you how to do that. One of the places we talk about it in the higher degrees, and we talk about it in the Corellian Book of the Dead, how to help a person to cross over if they're having trouble doing it naturally. And this is a very important thing. Sometimes a person becomes caught between the worlds, or part of their energy becomes caught between the worlds. It's not always complete, but they need help in crossing over completely. And you, as a living person, can help them with that. There are ways to do that. And if you'd like to learn about that, the Corellian Book of the Dead and also the third degree materials, and to some extent the second degree materials, talk about this and can help you with that. And you can find those at CorellianPublishing.com. And you can also find most of those teachings at witchschool.com. Witch School is a wonderful teaching resource, and lifetime memberships really are for a lifetime. Witch School is now in, I believe it's 24th year, coming up soon on its 25th. And people who started their lifetime membership on that first day have had a lot of years of teaching come from it. And Kayleen says the Book of the Dead is very good. Thank you, Kayleen. And I see now that we are nearing the end of our half hour. We want to take a moment for a word from our sponsors. Why? Well, because we love our sponsors. Hello, this is Rev Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and I would like to invite you to my Don Art showing and auction on Friday, May 9th, with original pieces and prints of my artwork and other interesting items, with the auction at 5 p.m. on Whatnot. And please stay tuned for more announcements and examples of art that will be coming. Thank you. And thank you to our sponsors, Equinox Learning Hub, and the Don Art auction on May 9th. And I'm looking forward to that event. And I will be, as we get closer to May 9th, I'll be showcasing some of the pieces of artwork that I'm doing for it. And speaking of the Corellian Book of the Dead and other things, since my retirement and most recent near-death experience, I have made it my mission to put into writing as much of my knowledge as I can. In the years before that, I was so busy with administration that I didn't get to write nearly as often as I would have liked to. I have written more books in the last year or so than in many years before. And there are many more coming because, I am very much aware that I only have so long to do this. And I have a lot more that I would like to say. And hello to Black Crystal in the chat room. It's good to see you. And so watch for more books coming. Tomorrow we are going to have a publishing announcement for you. And I think that will be quite exciting. I hope you'll join us for that. And I thank you for joining me today. And with that, let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. And we rejoice in this walk we walk together, and we ask you to help us to look at those experiences which may seem negative and to find the positive that is in them. Help us to find the positive in everything in life so that we may reap the benefit of it and fully enjoy our incarnational experience. We know that this is not always possible while we're going through it, but it becomes possible with time. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love. And knowing you are always with us from respect, we thank you for your presence. And may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always. And I shall see you again tomorrow.